The bet was made casually, the way rich people make bets they don't expect to lose. It was the spring of 1967. Los Angeles. A private dinner at a house in Bel Air that belonged to a record executive whose name nobody mentions anymore. Mostly because the story that unfolded that evening had nothing to do with him. The house was large, the kind built to impress without trying too hard. High ceilings, dark wood, a grand piano in the corner that probably hadn't been touched since it was moved in. There were maybe 25 people. Industry people mostly, a few performers, a couple of journalists who'd been trusted enough to be included, which meant they were trusted enough to stay quiet afterward. Frank Sinatra was there, 61 years old, already a monument, the kind of presence that made rooms reorganize themselves the moment he walked through a door. He was dressed the way he always dressed, unhurried, certain, a man who had long ago stopped needing anyone's approval and had somehow become more magnetic for it. Nancy Sinatra was there too, 26 years old. These boots are made for walking had come out the year before. She was no longer her father's daughter in the way the press still insisted on framing her. She had her own sound, her own audience, her own understanding of where music was going. She could read a room. She could read her father. She had been doing both her entire life. Jimi Hendrix arrived late. He came with a small group, invited through a chain of connections that nobody had fully tracked. He was 24. Are You Experienced had not yet been released in the United States, but the people in that room knew who he was. Word moved fast in those circles. What he had done in London, what he was doing in the clubs, what happened to audiences when he played. The stories were already circulating in that specific way that precedes a reputation becoming untouchable. He was wearing something purple. Someone who was there remembered that detail later, the color more than the garment itself. He moved quietly through the room, shook hands, smiled, said little. Frank Sinatra noticed him the way a man notices weather, with a glance, a brief recalibration, and then a return to whatever had been occupying him before. Nancy watched her father's glance. She watched it again when someone at the party mentioned Jimmy by name, in the context of what was happening in rock music, in the context of where everything seemed to be going. Frank made a sound that wasn't quite a word, a small dismissal, the kind only people close to him knew how to read. He plays electric guitar, someone offered, as if that explained the sound he'd made. They all play electric guitar, Frank said. Nancy picked up her glass, said nothing for a moment. Then, I'll bet you $100 he can play one of your songs. The room shifted, not dramatically, just a small, almost imperceptible tightening of attention. Frank looked at his daughter. One of my songs. Any song you name. A pause. The kind her father was good at. The kind that made people feel silence when they shouldn't. He's a rock musician, Frank said. Name the song, Dad. Someone went to find Jimmy. He was in a side room with two other people, standing near a window, looking out at the garden. He turned when the door opened, and the person who'd come to find him explained the situation in the way people explain things when they're not sure how the person will receive them. Quickly, with too many words. Jimmy was quiet for a moment. Which song? He asked. She didn't specify. He nodded. That was it. No performance of reluctance, no visible calculation. He followed the man back into the main room. Frank Sinatra was seated when Jimmy came in, a glass in his hand, an expression that had been arranged into something neutral, which was its own kind of statement. Nancy stood a few feet to the side. She had placed herself just far enough from her father to be her own person in this moment. There was an acoustic guitar in the corner of the room, not a grand instrument, a working guitar. Someone had already moved it closer to the center of the room, with the quiet efficiency of a party that had decided something was going to happen and was now committed to the staging. Jimmy sat down on the edge of an armchair and picked it up. He turned a peg, listened, turned another. The room had gone almost silent now. The conversations that had been filling the edges of the space had not so much stopped as faded, the way conversations do when something else becomes more interesting. Frank Sinatra watched the tuning. His expression hadn't changed. Someone asked him to name the song. He didn't hesitate. One for My Baby. It is a particular kind of song. Harold Arlen wrote the music. Johnny Mercer wrote the words. It was recorded first in 1943, and Frank had made it his own in a way that left almost no room for anyone else. Spare, late night, the kind of song that requires something from the singer beyond technique. It requires a specific kind of loneliness, an understanding of what it means to sit at a bar, at last call with no intention of leaving, and nothing to go back to. The melody is not complicated, the emotional architecture is. Frank's version, the one most people in that room had heard, the one that lived in their bones whether they knew it or not, was recorded in a single take in 1958. There are musicians who've studied that recording for years trying to understand what he did with the last two bars, how he stretched a phrase until it felt like it would break and then resolved it so quietly you almost missed the resolution. It was not a song you chose casually as a test. It was a song you chose if you wanted to make a point. Most musicians who might have been handed that challenge in that room would have played it carefully, respectfully, with visible effort, a demonstration of capability dressed as tribute. Jimi did not do that. He sat with the guitar for a moment before he started. Not long, maybe 4 or 5 seconds, but long enough that Nancy noticed, long enough that she understood something was happening that was not performance, not calculation, but listening. He was hearing something that wasn't in the room yet. Then he started to play. The opening notes were soft, genuinely soft. Not the softness of restraint, but the softness of something that doesn't need volume to fill space. His thumb moved on the bass strings while his fingers found the melody on top. Both things at once. Not separately, not alternating, but woven together the way breath and voice are woven together in a human being who isn't thinking about either. He didn't play it the way Frank played it. He didn't try to. He played it the way the song might have sounded if it had been written about a different kind of loneliness, a younger loneliness, less settled into itself. Still looking for a way out of the room it was sitting in. The melody was unchanged. Every note was where it was supposed to be, but the space between the notes was different. The weight was placed in different places. A pause here that wasn't in the original. A small run there that wasn't ornamentation, but felt like punctuation, like a sentence someone starts and then decides not to finish. When he sang, his voice was low. He didn't perform the song. He occupied it. Nancy Sinatra watched her father's face. She had been watching it her entire life. She had learned to read it before she could read words. The slight movement at the corner of his jaw. The almost invisible shift in how he held his glass. She had learned that the things her father felt most deeply were the things he showed the least. His expression did not change. That was how she knew. He played it through once, without stopping. When the last note ended, he let the string ring for a moment and then placed his palm flat against it. The silence it left was not empty. It was full of something that didn't have a name in the room. A few people began to applaud, and then a few more, and then almost everyone. But it was the kind of applause that sounds like it's apologizing for breaking something. Frank Sinatra did not applaud. He sat with his glass held at an angle that suggested he had forgotten it was there. He was looking at the floor, or past the floor, or at something that wasn't in the room. Jimi set the guitar down and looked up. Found the room. Nodded once. The way he nodded when he finished playing, like he was simply acknowledging that something had been completed. Nancy turned to her father. He reached into his jacket pocket, removed his wallet, and took out a $100 bill without counting it or looking at it. He held it out to her without looking at her either. She didn't take it right away. Dad. He set it on the table between them. She picked it up, folded it once, put it in her pocket. He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked to the other side of the room. Nobody spoke to him for several minutes. Later that evening, after the crowd had thinned and most of the people had gone, Frank Sinatra found himself near the side room where Jimi had been standing at the window earlier. Someone had told him Jimi was still there. He stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. Jimi was sitting in a chair now, the window dark behind him, the garden invisible. Frank sat down across from him, set his glass on the floor beside the chair. "You played that well," Frank said. It was not the sentence either of them expected him to say. Jimi looked at him. "It's a great song." "I know it is." A silence. Frank looked at his hands. He had the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime working, which surprised people who thought of him only as a voice, as a presence, as a creature of rooms like this one. Lines that ran deep, a stillness in them when they weren't doing anything. "Where did you learn to do that?" he said. "The two things at once, the melody on top and the bass underneath." "Listening," Jimmy said. "To old recordings mostly, trying to figure out what was happening." "Whose recordings?" "Yours, some of them." Frank picked up his glass, set it back down without drinking. "I've been on stages for 40 years, Frank said. "I've heard a lot of people cover my songs." He paused. "You didn't cover it." Jimmy waited. "You played it like it was yours." "It's not mine," Jimmy said. "It's a song. Songs belong to whoever's playing them at the moment they're being played." Frank looked at him for a long time. Something moved behind his eyes, not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The kind that happens between two people who have both spent their lives being told what category they belong in, and have each, in their own way, refused it. He stood, picked up his glass. "Nancy keeps her bets," he said, and walked out. Nancy Sinatra told this story once, in a long interview conducted in 2003 for a documentary that was never finished. The footage sat in a production company's archive for years. A journalist who'd worked on the project referenced it in a piece published in 2009. She said that her father never brought up that evening directly. That was not unusual. He had a way of processing things in silence that could last years. But she noticed that in the months after that night, he began listening differently. Not to rock music, not in any obvious way. But when she would play him something, he would sit with it longer. He would ask fewer dismissive questions. He had that quality, she said, that the very secure and the very honest share. The ability to be changed by something without announcing that they had been changed. She said she kept the $100 bill for a long time, folded in her wallet, then in a box, then somewhere she couldn't quite remember. She didn't cash it. She wasn't sure what it meant exactly, only that it meant something, and that some things were worth keeping even after they'd stopped being legible. She said she thought about Jimmy often after he died in 1970. She said, "He walked into that room not knowing he was proving anything. That was the whole thing, really. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He just played the song." A pause in the recording, the journalist noted. Then, "My father knew the difference. That's what the $100 was really about."